Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Scott Travis. I serve as Executive Director of Alumni Engagement here at Hope College. It's a pleasure to welcome you to one big virtual weekend and one of our first events, Building Resiliency Amid Uncertainty. We wish you were here on campus, but really appreciate you connecting with us from a distance as we work to keep our students, faculty, and staff safe, and as we demonstrate our own special kind of Hope College resilience this semester. I invite you to virtually walk with me through these arches and imagine yourself coming into campus off of College Avenue and into the Pine Grove behind Graves. You made it. You're here just in time to see the colors change, and you're participating in one big virtual weekend, combined homecoming and family weekend. I encourage you to check out hope.edu/onebigweekend for more ways to connect in the next 2 days. So we'll have events taking place today all the way through Saturday evening, and this is just one of our first. Right now, we are fortunate to have a very talented member of Hope's faculty with us. Dr. Daryl Van Tongeren is an associate professor of psychology here at Hope College. Before joining the faculty in 2012, he was a postdoctoral fellow at Virginia Commonwealth. His research focuses on the social motivation for meaning. Specifically, he and his students adopt a social cognitive approach to study virtues such as forgiveness and humility. His research has been funded by generous grants from the John Templeton Foundation. And some of you that signed up early for this event should have received this in the mail, a copy of his latest book. If you haven't received it yet and you were in the first group to sign up, we have those out on the way. So if you have questions about that, if you email alumni@hope.edu. But Daryl's research focuses on explanations for some of life's big questions. He's recently been cited in the New York Times, Fast Company, and Associated Press articles, as well as being a regular contributor to Psychology Today. When he and his wife, Sarah, a mental health therapist, set out to write a book about coping with suffering, they had no idea that the release would coincide with a global pandemic and so much uncertainty in our world. But it did, and here we are. We're ready to learn how we can practice resiliency in the midst of all of the chaos and uncertainty that's around us. At this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Van Tongeren. Daryl, take it away.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks to all of you for attending. I'm very grateful to be part of Hope's One Big Virtual Weekend. I'm really grateful to talk to you today about building resilience amid uncertainty. To give you an overview of today's webinar, first I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem of suffering. I'll talk also a little bit about the uncertainty of COVID-19, the importance of building meaning, and then I hope to give you some really practical steps to build resilience so you can walk away from this time together with things that you can actually implement in your own life right away. But I think the first thing that we have to get out of the way is to answer the question, wait a minute, who actually studies suffering? Yes, this is about uncertainty, but suffering and uncertainty are intricately tied together. So who on earth would study something like suffering? Well, to help give you a little bit of frame of where I'm coming from, I want to share a little bit of my own personal story. So in graduate school, I started studying how people find meaning in life, and particularly how people find meaning in life when they bump up against some of the existential realities of life, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Some of the big questions like the uncertainty of living in times that are changing or navigating one's changing identity. And as I was doing this academic work, and it was all very cognitive and in my head, right around that time, my brother called it to me and he reached out and said that he was going to have an upcoming heart surgery. And he had had a previous surgery, and this surgery seemed to be a routine one. And so he asked for prayers, and we prayed with him. He later went into surgery, but things didn't go as the doctors planned. And a few days later, I got a call from my parents that I really needed to get out to Colorado to be with family. And sadly, things turned for the worse, and my brother passed away unexpectedly at the age of 34. He had 3 kids under the age of 6, and now and a wife. And suddenly, everything I thought I knew about suffering, everything I thought I knew about how people made meaning, everything I thought I knew about coming to terms with existential realities, suddenly took a personal and very meaningful change of course. His sudden death was thought by the doctors to have a very strong genetic component, which put my own health future in jeopardy. We were uncertain if I would suffer the same fate as my brother, and whether my wife Sarah would suffer the same fate as his wife. And we were uncertain: would I survive? Would I have the same type of condition that took my brother's life? Around this time, Sarah and I were thinking about starting a family. We were kind of right in that time in our careers where it seemed like the time was right. But given the uncertain nature of the genetic condition that took my brother's life, doctors told us that we should wait, that this is not something that would be wise. We need to get more information. Obviously, we were heartbroken about this. And for years, we grieved not only the loss of my brother, but also the loss of this future, a future involving a family that we thought that we would have. After many, many years and more consultations with doctors, we were finally given the green light that we could start trying to have a family, only to realize that we couldn't, that we received a diagnosis of infertility. And so each of these different seasons of suffering and of loss and of grief compounded upon each other. And we realized that suffering is really something that's just an inherent part of life. I've suffered, you've suffered, we've all suffered, and we will all suffer in the future. Suffering is almost guaranteed. And so a few years ago, the academic and the personal came together when we were given an opportunity to write a book about suffering and to draw not only from our personal experiences, but also from cutting edge psychological science and the best practices in clinical psychology to try to help people understand: how can you flourish in the midst of suffering? How can you build resilience in uncertain times? And I want to share some of that with you today. So suffering poses a bit of a problem. And so suffering is pain. There's a difference, rather, between suffering and pain. So pain is something that's explainable. It has a distinct trajectory and is very focused. It's in one area of our life. But suffering, on the other hand, is psychological or emotional pain that is unexplainable, or it's so violating, so persistent and enduring that it's fundamentally life-changing. And many of you, I have imagined, have experienced suffering in your life. You've had things happen that have been unexplained. You have had things happen to you that have violated some of the deepest assumptions about how you believe the world should work. You've endured things that have been persistent, and these have fundamentally changed your lives. This is suffering. And as I mentioned, suffering is an inherent part of life. It's not something that we can escape, and it's not something that is necessarily bad or wrong. It's just a part of the natural course of life. Right now, if we think about suffering in the context of the uncertainty of COVID-19, we're really living through events. We're experiencing a collective sense of suffering that is inevitable and will indelibly change us, both individually and collectively. There's so much that we don't know about what the future holds for us. And there's so much that we've already endured in the past several months, 7, 8 months. Many of you have known people or have been personally affected by this pandemic. Many of you are uncertain about what a potential resolution in the future might actually look like. And so we're all teetering on the edge, some of us more than others, really feeling the weight of this suffering that we're currently going through. So why does suffering pose a problem? Well, each of us has a worldview. And when we think about a worldview, we want to think about a set of attitudes or beliefs, expectations or assumptions about the way that we think the world should work. So we have expectations about the way the world operates, about our place in the world, and how we can plan for the future. So part of our worldviews involve beliefs about ourselves. So whether we think we can change or whether we think we're stagnant, whether we think we're good or whether we think we're inherently not good, whether we believe that we can control events or events are outside of our control. Our worldview involves beliefs about other people. Do you trust other people inherently or do you not? Are you more securely attached in your relationships or more anxious or avoidant with other people? And we also hold beliefs about the world. For example, many of us believe that the world is a just place, that good people get good outcomes and well, bad things happen to bad people. And we also hold beliefs about God, maybe about God's benevolence or God's power or God's omniscience. And so the reason why we have these worldviews is that they helped shield us from some of the existential concerns that arise when we encounter and ask some of the bigger questions in life. So there's 4 primary existential concerns that researchers have looked at. The first is this concern of groundlessness. So groundlessness is the idea that the world is largely outside of our control, but we still have to make decisions in the midst of it. Does that sound a little bit like COVID? Does that sound a little bit like the pandemic? We're not quite sure. We don't have all the information and we can't control the world and certainly can't control other people, but we still have to make decisions. Is it safe to go here? Is it safe to meet with these friends? Is it safe to visit family? Is it safe to visit a grandchild? And that uncertainty can cause a great deal of anxiety. A second existential concern is this fear of isolation. So each of us is experiencing our suffering and indeed COVID-19 in very unique ways. And none of us truly know what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. We can empathize, we can attempt to feel sympathy, but no one really knows what it's like to be you, and you don't know what it's like to be other people. And that fundamental sense of isolation can be rather anxiety provoking. Here too, COVID stings because many of us have been isolated from other people, unable to be around and close to the people that we love. A third existential concern is identity. Who are we? How do we make sense of our purpose? How do we understand what our role is in this world? Many times people have a lot of anxiety trying to figure out what should they do in their career, or maybe later in life, have I lived a generative and generous and loving enough life? And so if we live in a world that's outside of our control and where we're fundamentally isolated from one another and we're unsure about our identity, the one thing that we are certain about, sadly, is death. Now, some of you are thinking, my gosh, she's only 15 minutes into this talk and things are already getting decidedly dark. Don't worry, this is a talk about resiliency, and we will get there. But one of the core existential concerns, one of the big realities of life that can cause a fair amount of anxiety is the realization that one day we will die. That is a certainty, even more certain than taxes, right? Someone used to say the only 2 things that are certain are paying taxes and death. Well, it's definitely death. Death is certain. All of us will die. And so taken together, this paints a rather bleak reality. If we realize things are out of our control, we're isolated, our identity is uncertain, and death is the only certainty. And in fact, this can often lead us to a sense of meaninglessness. Many people who can't come to terms with these realities conclude that life must be meaningless, that there's no purpose, there's no inherent value. And so worldviews, each of us have a set of beliefs that help answer these existential questions. And for many religious people, for many people of hope, religion, a belief in God, an enduring Christian faith can help answer many of those questions about about who's in control, about whether or not we are truly isolated, about where our identity comes from, and about how to answer the reality of death. But over time, suffering can erode some of these worldviews. Like I mentioned, our worldviews carry with them assumptions, the ways we think the world is going to be and how the world should work. I remember before my brother passed away, he and I joked about, growing old together and where we would want to live and where we would want our families to be and what it would be like, when we were old and gray one day. I expected that my brother would live a long time, that he and I would have a long time together, that our problems would be the fight that we'd be bickering for the next 40 or 50 years. I never imagined that the problem would be that he wouldn't be around. His, in my mind, premature death. So his death that I thought came way too soon violated how I thought the world was supposed to work. I didn't think that someone was supposed to leave 3 kids under the age of 6 and a widow at the age of 34. That violated the way I thought the world was supposed to work. And so oftentimes the pressure of suffering can expose cracks in our worldviews. And what we realize is the way we thought the world was supposed to work isn't actually holding up to the way the world is working. I thought my brother was supposed to live a long time. I thought that we'd have a lot more time together. To be honest, I thought the world was fair, that my brother was a good person, and why did something bad happen to someone so good? And where was God in this? If God was so good and loving and so powerful, why not save my brother? Did God not care? Was God not powerful enough? And so suffering can peel back all of those layers and reveals the small cracks in our worldviews. And when we start going through that process of questioning, we oftentimes feel very vulnerable to the weight and the anxiety of those existential concerns. We start questioning, well, if I was wrong about this, might I be wrong about other things as well? And then we start wondering if we don't have some of the answers we thought we had to some of these big questions in life. There's a conflict between the way we expect the world to be and the way the world really is. And I'm imagining for many of you right now in this pandemic, if you're anything like me, I didn't expect 2020 to go like this. I had great plans. I had exciting trips I wanted to go on. I had trips that I had airline tickets for. There are people I wanted to see, family I wanted to spend time with. But the reality of the way the world is right now is starkly different from that. So uncertainty such as COVID-19 can make our existential fears more heightened. When we realize that the future isn't as solid as we thought, we can't actually predict with great certainty what will happen to us, we begin to realize that we're not in control, and we start feeling a greater degree of anxiety. So our first take-home point, I'm a teacher, right? So I have to make sure you have take-home points. It's not like homework. I just want to make sure you remember something from this webinar. So I'll have 4. So you at least have to tune in 4 times during this talk. The first take-home point is that we all have a worldview about the way the world is supposed to work. But suffering reveals how wrong we are about that. Well, let's transition to the uncertainties of COVID-19. With this understanding of this framework of suffering, let's shift and talk about how the uncertainty of COVID-19 might be playing out in our lives. So in what ways does COVID-19 elicit some uncertainty? Well, it's going to hit on all of these different existential realities in its own way. So remember, the first existential reality is groundlessness. Things are outside of our control. So if you're anything like me, you've been asking this question for a while: when will this be over? And, is there someone I can trust about when this can be over in my own mind? When do I feel like it would be safe again? And what this reveals to me is that there are things that I can control. I can control my behavior, but there's also things I can't control. I can't control other people's behavior, whether or not other people act responsibly, follow the best guidance for social distancing, for wearing a mask, for being safe and upholding the precautions. But there are things that I can control, but there's largely things that I cannot. COVID-19 also really makes us question features of our identity. What will life look like after COVID? I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with family or with friends about what will life look like? And we're all making really good guesses, and I bet we're all wrong. I don't know if any of us know what it'll look like. And for many people, I imagine that living through this pandemic has led them to think that they've really lost the ability to do things that make them feel like themselves. If you're unable to do things that make me feel like me. So if you're a really social person and connecting with other people, being close with other people, close physical proximity is kind of one of your defining characteristics, COVID-19 is a challenge. Being away from people might feel like you've lost the ability to do something you love. Not being in front of students, not working side by side, that's challenging. That feels like a loss. I bet we all feel a little bit more isolated. We all might feel a little bit more alone in this process. You might have asked yourself, well, who can I trust? Right? If you've ever had those conversations, you're thinking about, should I have a nice, socially distanced gathering with another set of friends, maybe in the backyard. You might be asking yourself, well, can we trust that they haven't been exposed? Can we trust that they'll stay the right distance away and not get too close or too friendly? Can we, we might ask ourselves, when will we be able to be with our close friends again? When can we just hang out inside? When can we go on a trip together? And so it can feel rather isolating and rather lonely as we move through COVID-19. And COVID-19 also brings up fears of death because it's deadly. It really is. And so people often fear, will I get sick? And if so, how bad will it be? So you can see that the uncertainty of COVID-19 really hits all four of these existential realities and can elicit our anxiety across all of these different domains. So really, living through COVID-19 can feel a lot like suffering. All of these uncertainties can make our existential anxiety much worse. My wife is a mental health therapist, and she has been incredibly busy since the start of this pandemic. And she's mentioned to me that it is very common that a number of people are feeling heightened anxiety, heightened feelings of hopelessness. This entire pandemic is a great strain on mental health. And when our existential anxiety is high, what can happen is we can start getting defensive. We shift from the mode of being able to grow, we shift from openness into security, into being closed, into a protective mode. And that makes it really hard for us to find a sense of flourishing in the midst of our suffering. Oftentimes we become rigid and we really start defending our worldviews. We don't listen to new information. We double down on what we think we believe, and we start defending. And oftentimes that can lead to interpersonal conflict. Your way of seeing the pandemic versus other people with whom you disagree can create a lot of tension. We're going to prioritize our security, and many times our default reaction is to stop looking for ways to grow. It's just about staying safe. And while I absolutely think that safety is a very high concern, if we stay stuck in security for too long, we begin to stagnate. We begin to feel closed in, and we stop having the opportunity, or we stop taking the opportunity to look for ways to grow. And oftentimes we can feel overwhelmed with fear, and we can hesitate making decisions. Sometimes it just feels like getting through the next day is all we can do. The next meeting, the next Zoom call is all that we can do. And we, because we don't know what the future holds, we become afraid and we hesitate to make decisions. And so uncertainty can really prolong our feelings of suffering. Being mired in COVID-19 can make us feel like suffering will not have an end. So I'm about to discuss briefly the seasons of suffering, how we move through this period of uncertainty or suffering. But before I do, I wanted to pause for a moment in case anybody had any questions at this point. If you do, I welcome you to put the questions into the Q&A or to put the questions into the chat, and Scott would be happy to moderate that. But if we could just pause for a moment in case anyone has questions.
We don't have any in the queue yet, but there's a Q&A in the menu where you can chat those in through the Q&A feature, and we'll answer those. So if you have them now, go ahead and send them in. And even as we enter this next section, if you want to add some questions in there, the next time we pause, we'll be able to have those. So as you take in this information, feel free to interact through the Q&A.
Thanks, Scott. So we'll move forward with these seasons, and if you have questions, I welcome you to add those in. So we like to think about moving through seasons as a metaphor of phases of light. And we like to think of sunset as when suffering stings. When you first got that news that COVID-19 has now become a reality that we never envisioned. So the sting of suffering is that initial shift in the way we expected the world to be, and now the way the world is. And it's hard to process, and it feels overwhelming. It feels shocking. It can feel anxiety provoking. And really, this is the small shift toward darkness. The second phase is kind of moving more into the darkness. And this is where a number of people oftentimes get a little bit stuck. My sense is if you want to move forward and you want to find flourishing and you want to be able to find resilience in the midst of uncertainty or in the midst of this existential suffering, it's important, it's critical to accept the new painful reality. But what we see is many people will not accept the new painful reality of their suffering, whether that's accepting the painful reality of COVID-19 or accepting the painful reality of something that just feels too heavy to bear. Whatever your suffering is, it may feel too heavy to bear. But acceptance is key. It's key to being able to flourish in the midst of suffering. People who can't engage and accept that new reality oftentimes get stuck at this phase. For those who can, they often enter a rather unsettling but very important process of deconstruction, of challenging the beliefs that you once held that no longer fit. So the assumption I had about the way I thought the world was supposed to work that got violated when my brother passed away, I had to revise those beliefs. I had to discard the beliefs that wouldn't hold up. I had to discard some beliefs I had about God that honestly weren't matching with the reality of life. And now, lest you think we just end with a period of deconstruction, and while some do, I don't recommend making that the final destination. It's a fine layover. But I would book a ticket to the next phase, and the next phase is reconstruction. And reconstruction is when we find new ways of making sense of the world. So I did re-envision the way I understood God, and I got rid of and discarded beliefs that honestly weren't true. And then I found new ways of engaging God that seemed to fit the reality of what I had experienced. And so building back up a worldview that was consonant and fit with my experiences in the world. And that's when you start seeing that daybreak. That's when you start seeing light come back. Whereas midnight feels like the darkest moments when you can start reassembling that worldview, however differently it looks. You start seeing the hope of daylight. And daylight is when you can begin to live authentically. When you are living according to your values and your worldview now matches more closely, none of us are perfect, but more closely matches the reality of the suffering that you've experienced. That's when you can live more authentically. That's when you can live in accordance with your values. So the second take-home point, again, I said there's going to be 4, so you're halfway there. Flourishing requires accepting the reality of what is. Not what we want to be, not what we had expected it to be, not what we wish it was, but the reality of what is. So what about meaning? Where does meaning come into play? So meaning is strained by suffering and uncertainty. It's hard for us to find a sense of meaning when we're in the midst of suffering, when we're in the midst of this uncertainty. But it may be one primary way that people flourish in the midst of their struggles. So meaning is an important way that we can find a sense of resilience in the midst of uncertainty and in the midst of our suffering. So let me define what I mean by meaning. It's the subjective feeling that my life and my experiences make sense, matter, and are purposeful. That I can gain a sense of coherence when I'm looking out into the world, that I matter and that I am purposeful. So just to clarify, I'm talking about the meaning that we can find in life, not the meaning of life. So if you came looking for the meaning of life, I don't know, maybe you should check back. I doubt I'll ever find it. But the meaning in life, how people find meaning in their day-to-day, that's what I'm referring to. And so what comprises meaning? Well, there's 3, and we'll move through these quickly. There's 3 components. One is coherence, so when things make sense. The second is significance, when you feel like you matter. And then the third is purpose, when you feel like you're connected to something larger. So when you can make sense of the world, when you feel like you matter, and when you feel connected to something larger or more transcendent, that's what feels meaningful. So the big idea for building resilience in the midst of uncertainty is that cultivating meaning is the key to flourishing in all seasons of life, including when we are suffering. So if you are able to find a sense of meaning in the midst of suffering, and the psychological science backs this up, research backs this up, if you can find meaning in the midst of your suffering, you're going to be more likely to flourish. You're going to have better mental health. It's been linked to better physical health. It's been linked to perceived growth. The key is cultivating meaning. So finding coherence again. And sometimes, and at least I found this to be true for me, ironically, understanding that some suffering is just senseless sometimes is a way to make sense of suffering. Rather than trying to come up with an elaborate explanation for why something happens, sometimes realizing there's no explanation, or I'll never know. It will continue to elude me. That can help us make sense of suffering. Finding significance, so connecting with loved ones, finding support, feeling valued, feeling loved, connecting with others and feeling like we matter is a way of finding meaning. And then finally, finding a purpose, whether it's as small as making it one more day through the pandemic or something larger that often motivates us to work towards a broader goal, can help us develop a sense of meaning. So how might we find meaning in the midst of COVID? Well, at one place we can start is making sense of this pandemic, which is often hard. And I know there's a lot of competing theories about how we might be able to make sense of this. And one Potential pathway forward could be, well, it's a pandemic, right? These things happen. They happen every 100 years or so. It just happens to be about that time. Are there things that people could have done to make this better or worse? Absolutely. But sometimes suffering just happens. If you can find a way to connect with others in ways that affirm your values and affirm your own sense of value, you're going to find a deeper sense of significance. So if you can still connect with loved ones, FaceTiming, Zooming, calling, socially distanced hanging out, driving by and waving. I've been really impressed by how creative people are on finding social connection while staying physically distanced. I'm impressed. And then having some type of purpose, a direction or a connection to something larger than yourselves, larger than myself, that helps us find a sense of meaning. If there's something that you're living for, looking forward to, something that is connecting you more than just your own internal interior experience, meaning is about more than just me. It's about more than just me. That can help you build some meaning. So the third take-home point is that you don't have to wait for suffering to subside in order to start cultivating meaning. You don't have to wait for suffering to subside before you start cultivating meaning. So how would we go about building a sense of existential resilience in the midst of COVID? Well, the first thing you could do is start nurturing this sense of meaning. And what I'd like to suggest is thinking about 3 H's for nurturing meaning. The first is think about nurturing meaning and think about your head. So your head, think about transcendent practices. How are ways that you can engage your religious or spiritual values in your religious or spiritual traditions? That will help move you past yourself. That will help connect you with something bigger than yourself, to a sense of meaning. The second is the heart. Can you invest in relationships with loved ones? One of the bedrocks of meaning is relationships. And so to the degree that you can connect with others, you can invest in those relationships, those are going to provide you with a deep sense of meaning, even amidst the uncertainty of COVID. And then think about your hands. Is there something that you can do to act virtuously, pro-socially, someplace in some way that you can give back to other people in the midst of this uncertain and tragic time? Thinking about nurturing meaning in your head, your heart, and your hands will be a rather robust approach to trying to find meaning in the midst of this suffering. A second practical suggestion for building existential resilience is to view these existential threats and uncertainty in general as facts and not fears. So the realization that life is out of our control, that nobody will truly know what it's like to be us, that our identity shifts throughout our life, and that death is certain, those don't have to be fearful threats. Those are facts. Those are truths and not threats. They're facts, not fears. And the sooner we can realize that these are just some of the natural givens of life, the more we can befriend them, the more that we can engage them, and the more that we can engage them with openness and growth rather than security and defensiveness. And realizing that suffering and uncertainty are simply a part of life. It will happen. Suffering will be a natural part of the life cycle for all of us. And uncertainty will continue to be a consistent theme in life. And then one third way I suggest practically to build a sense of existential resilience is by developing what I like to call, or other researchers, lots of people like to call, existential security. So this is a tentative resolve about how to address these existential issues. So I'd like to highlight the word tentative. So I like to think about, if you're building a house, think about just the framework, just the most important pillars. Are there a few things that are relatively unmovable, that you can rest on, but leaving a lot of room for flexibility and for uncertainty. So what are the things that you know in your core sense of self, in your being, are true? And holding on to those pillars, those things as framing your house, a relatively few number of them, and then having the ability to be adaptively flexible with the rest of your set of worldviews, knowing that you're anchored in those pillars, will allow you to withstand future storms and future suffering. This allows both for some security that comes from those pillars, from those unmovable core values that you have, while also maintaining room for growth and expansion for things that you're not completely sure on, things that aren't as essential to the way you see the world. So the fourth and final take-home point is that there's no need to fear existential realities. Think about it. They're just realities. They're nothing to fear. So how do we move forward? Well, I'd like to contend that we can experience growth and positive development in the midst of and also after suffering. You know, we don't have to wait for suffering to be over in order to flourish. But critically, we have to name our pain and we have to accept the new reality before moving forward. It is okay. I encourage you to lament and name your grief. Where have you felt the losses? Where have you felt the sadness? Name those things and come to terms with and accept those things. And it will be a process. It is not as easy as like, oh, great, now I accept it. I fully understand it's a process. But understanding that those new realities are key before you can move forward in the process. You know, this requires for us to rewrite the narrative story of our life. I didn't want a narrative that included suffering. I didn't want to be the person whose brother passed away early. I didn't want to be the person who may or may not have some genetic health condition. I didn't want that to be my story. As long as I kept trying to outrun that story, I could never fully engage with and be honest about that suffering. And so I had to rewrite my narrative. I had to rethink the way I saw myself. And I had to incorporate that suffering as part of my narrative. It doesn't define me. It's not the only thing that defines me. I'm more multifaceted than that. I like to run marathons. I like to make hot sauce. I grow my own chili peppers, right? I'm more than that, but I'm also partly that. That's also part of me. And so I encourage you to think about the ways in which you might have to incorporate your own stories of suffering in your own narrative. We can start putting into practice ways to come to terms with these existential realities. Knowing that these are the existential realities, they're facts, they're not fears, they're not things we have to be fearful of, they're not threats, can allow us to start cultivating meaning now, not waiting for suffering to be over, because frankly, we don't know what the future holds. We don't know when more suffering will strike or when this suffering will subside. So I'd encourage you to start cultivating meaning today. Don't wait. Start cultivating meaning today. Doing those things will help you build a sense of resilience, even when the future is uncertain. Even when we don't know what we can hold on to, you can start cultivating meaning today. I did see a couple questions come in, and I would really welcome us using the last 10 minutes or so for questions. I really do thank you for spending the beginning of One Big Virtual Weekend with me. I'd love to hear from you. If you have questions, you can email me at vantongeren@hope.edu. You can find me and harass me on Twitter. I'm not on there very often, but Dr. Van Tongeren, or Instagram at Daryl Van Tongeren. For those who are interested, our book is available on Amazon. It's called The Courage to Suffer, a new clinical framework for life's greatest crises. And it's also available on the Templeton Press website. And so I'd now like to open the floor to shorter speeches disguised as questions.
Thanks, Daryl. We have the Q&A function open. We had a question about the video. We are recording this and we'll make it available on the Alumni and Family Engagement blog. You can get to that at hope.edu/alumni. So look for that in the coming days. And then Patty had a thought about and jumped out to me too, the phases of light as St. John of the Cross and the dark night of the soul. So she was sharing that a little bit as a thought. So thanks, Patty, for that. You can chat in questions right now. We do have another 12 minutes of our time that we planned. And if you're really brave, you can raise your hand in the participant panel, and I can actually make it where you can share with the group. So if you've got a microphone ready to go, raise your hand if you want to share with the group. Try to make this as participatory as possible on a platform like this, or use that chat function. Don't be shy. All right, our first question, Daryl, that came in here is from Deb. She's thanking you for your research and experience, but curious about the shortage of therapists during this time. Any research or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do, and I can speak anecdotally. Like I mentioned, my wife is a mental health therapist, and I do know that there is a greater demand than there are supply of therapists. I would say, to the degree that you could find a therapist, first thank them for the work that they're doing. But I do think that there is a shortage right now, and so we need to be mindful of being able to support one another the best way we can. I know that therapy offers something that other traditional sources of support can't, and in that way it's incredibly valuable, and I highly recommend it. It might also just require getting on waiting lists, and staying on waiting lists for a while until you can see a therapist, but I highly recommend doing so if you're able to.
All right, the next question is about your interactions with students. How have you shared this message or these topics with students in your work, and maybe a few thoughts on that? And then after you speak to that, we will open it up for Doug Johnson to join us live. He's got his hand raised in the chat. So, thoughts with students.
Yes, I've shared a bit about this with students. I am very fortunate enough to teach a senior seminar on meaning and finding a meaningful life. And so I was able to share a bit of this story and a bit of this research with my students. And I find students, first of all, to be incredibly kind and compassionate, and really very affirming of this approach. And I find students want to engage these existential questions. They like the big questions. They come to a place like Hope, they really come to Hope, to ask these big questions in the backdrop and in the context of the historic Christian faith. And I found sharing this and talking with students about this to be so deeply rewarding. And I'm grateful for the opportunities when I can.
How have you seen students struggle during this time, during COVID? What are you seeing as some of the biggest challenges for our students during this time?
I think one of the biggest challenges I see is that violation of expectations. And so how many of them never envisioned their college years to be spent like this, whether it's their first year at Hope or whether it's their last year at Hope? They never imagined this type of reality. And many of them have been honest about lamenting that reality, lamenting that their college experience isn't what they had thought. And so the expectation of what they had imagined and the reality of what is creating pain, is creating grief, and it's causing them to have to come to terms with a lot of their own lament and a lot of their own sadness about that.
Great, thanks for sharing that, and also for the work that you're doing with our students. I'm going to switch over to Doug, who has his hand raised and has been patiently waiting. Doug, you are permitted to join us if you want to share your thoughts. All right, Doug might be working on getting his audio or video working, so I'm going to leave that open. So Doug might join us at any moment, but in the meantime, we have a question from Jeff. Appreciates the recognition of the ability for people to thrive and struggle at the same time. Too many of us feel it is all or nothing. Does hope help students work through steps to clarify their values, passion, and purpose so they can find greater meaning and thus resiliency? So maybe Daryl, in your perspective as a Hope faculty member, speak to the connection between values and what we're doing with students here on campus and developing resiliency.
Yeah, great question. I really appreciate you asking that question. And that's one of the things that makes me most excited to work at Hope is these are questions as a faculty member, as an advisee or advisor who chats with my advisees, a faculty member who chats with my students, a research supervisor who works collaboratively with students. We talk about these values. We talk about these topics frequently. And this is the fertile soil of hope that we're able to have these types of conversations. And so we really do talk about clarifying values, about finding a purpose, about trying to find a way to engage your values in ways that will provide you with a sense of meaning. And so I've found myself in countless conversations in class, but also outside of class, in my office, on the sidewalk, about these types of topics. And I do see hope as making these types of questions a priority.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions coming in. Doug's mic isn't working. I connected with him via chat. So thanks, Doug, for letting me know about that. If you want to share your thought or question in the Q&A, please go ahead and do that. And the next question is from Liz. Do you have any recommendations for us as parents to help our freshman students who are stuck in isolation and that gap between expectations and reality? So you spoke to that gap, and I've heard that from students as well. What are your thoughts on some best practices for coaching and parenting college students through that gap?
Yeah, wow. I'll try to put on that hat real quick. So I think one place to start would be, first of all, to affirm that gap is painful, and to acknowledge that, to lament with your student, to say, gosh, I can't imagine what that would be like. I empathize with you. I understand that is so sad, and that this must be so challenging. And then I think the next part would be to say, okay, now that we know that what is, now that we've grieved what we wanted it to be, but now that we realize what is, how can we move forward fruitfully with the reality of what is? How can we move forward saying, this is what life has given us right now? And we can in our hearts feel, in our heads know that it's unfair, but how do we move forward with what is? And trying to make the best out of what is. And I also think, and this is where the virtue of hope comes in, knowing that it won't always be like this. Now, we don't know how it will be, but we do have a hope that it won't always be like this. So accepting what is with a little bit of optimism and positive expectation toward a better future, of saying, I think it could get better, but until it does, I'm going to live in the reality of what is.
Great questions. We've got some more coming in. First, a technical question for you, Dr. Van Tongeren. Are you comfortable doing like a PDF of your slides? We've had some people ask for some of the lists and resources that you have in them. If you send me the PDF, I can send that out to the email that everyone used to register, as well as doing the video online. So is that something
Absolutely.
we can do?
Absolutely.
I put you on the spot in front of all of our participants, so you couldn't really say no, I guess.
No, I absolutely. Yes.
Thank you very much. So that was a question that came in through the chat from Doug. Open question. This is a good one from Crystal. Do the seasons of suffering, those phases and seasons you went through, do they occur in a linear fashion, or can one go back and forth between them?
So glad you asked this. When my wife and I were writing this book, she wanted to make sure I was explicitly clear. You do not have to move in a linear fashion. You can go backward and forward. You can jump. You can skip ahead, do not pass go. You can go back to St. Charles Place. So you can go in any different direction through those. And some people will start at one place, work forward, move back. They don't have to be linear.
I like the Monopoly analogy. Maybe that will be your next book. Although the definition of suffering might be playing Monopoly sometimes, depending. Game never ends. All right, we're caught up on our questions. Any other questions from our attendees? Feel free to put those in now. We'll spend 1 or 2 minutes waiting for 1 or 2 more questions. How long do you wait in class for silence with questions?
A fair amount of time. You can ask my Psych 100 students. My wife is a therapist. She taught me something called therapeutic silence, and I have told my students I can outlast you. So
Yeah, clearly I'm pretty bad at that. As moderator, I lasted about 20 seconds there before I asked you a question.
not a problem.
All right, I think we're caught up. So we're going to wrap this up,
Great.
first of all, by saying thank you, Dr. Van Tongeren, for your time and expertise to share with our alumni, families, and some students on the webinar today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is obviously not the way we prefer to connect with you, but it is a valuable way to share information and to engage you with our experts here on campus and with the life of the college. And we're so thankful that you took time out of your day to join us. You can find more ways to connect One Big Weekend. So hope.edu/onebigweekend. That's a set of virtual events for families and alumni taking place now through Saturday. So thanks once again, everybody, and look for the video on the blog and check your email for the slides. If you have any further questions for either of us, feel free to email alumni@hope.edu and we can get those in the right direction. So thanks, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your virtual One Big Weekend.
Thank you.
Have a great day.